Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Hayevsky. I am a psychometrician with Kaplan Test Prep in New York City. And I'm going to talk to you today about considerations and performance evaluations in computerized formative assessment. And I think I'm a bit of an outlier, as I was just saying a few minutes ago, because formative assessment is not really, I think, as frequently talked about as summative assessments. We'll talk about some of the differences in a minute. But I think it is probably the field in psychometrics and in educational testing that has the largest potential right now for growth and development, because we're looking at not only informing our tests based on the learning trajectory, but also looking specifically at doing things like adaptive learning. And you'll see some pieces of that in my presentation today. So what are some of the differences? Because if you're not familiar with them, I think this will behoove us to sort of cover very quickly. But when we think about summative assessment, we have some sort of trajectory in terms of learning that is occurring, and then assessment usually happens after teaching is executed. And we can still evaluate this accordingly within the different topics or content domain or dimensionality. In formative assessment, that is not entirely the same. Here specifically, the assessment can happen during or before instruction is occurring, so as to actually inform the instruction process itself. And it helps us to really get a better sense of whether the students are picking up information correctly and whether they're benefiting from the resources that we're giving them. And you can see that this also does not necessarily have to happen sort of in the simultaneous kind of coverage of content. It can be either cascaded, it can be stacked temporarily, and the assessments essentially will give us these interim kind of insights into the formative process and can still at the very end be used to evaluate very similarly as in the summative, where at the very end of the process of the education, you can still conduct your assessment summatively and still get the information regarding the process and the mastery of students within the unique topics. So formative assessment is not as widely funded and supported, I think, in many ways as summative assessments. A lot of this has something to do with the fact that the outcomes are very implicit in the high-stakes decision-making processes. Originally, it was believed that the sole responsibility for formative assessment was with the instructors. So a lot of testing publishers were really not focusing a lot on the instruction and the remediation process, because the focus was really on the high decision-making. So there's really a lot to be said in terms of the popularized types. So there's diagnostic testing, strategic questioning in classrooms and polls, interim evaluations, all of which I think have not really yet reaped the benefits of computerized adaptive testing, have not really reaped the benefits of being able to have interim testing and provide feedback. So I think the first stopover that I want to do in this presentation is about the integration with instructional design. And I think this is very valuable for the kind of setup that we usually get with computerized adaptive testings, because whenever we develop something in total isolation from either learning science or the content experts to consumers, we don't really get a satisfactory product. And I think a lot of the summative assessments miss sort of that opportunity. I'm not saying they're wrong, but I think they miss that opportunity to better understand how students are learning. We also know historically that when students have ownership of the learning process, they actually notably improve their mastery. They sort of understand that doing better has direct bearing on their life and their education. And we see this now with the new developments in gamification. Students who really own that kind of process do better. Also, sequential review and guided remediation has been demonstrated for effective long-term retention. We don't have to go very far to look for real examples of this, or this is not really new ideas, right? Hermann Ebbinghaus in 1885, when he proposed the forgetting curve, already gave us insight into these kinds of processes. And I apologize that this is a bit pixelated. But the idea is that once you retain information, or once you study information, as time goes on, you're going to be forgetting that information. So here the important part is that when you're going to be forgetting it, you want to review that information in order for that learning curve to asymptotically essentially approach 100%, that you retain all of the information that is relevant for your mastery component. And I think right here is where interim testing or any type of formative assessment would be absolutely instrumental in understanding how these review processes are actually working, in order for us to then give better resources and better information directly back to the students. So what are some of these considerations for performance evaluations? I think in fact, you could argue that all of the aspects of summative assessment, performance evaluations, still apply to formative assessment as well. The context might be slightly different, but they still apply, which means you have to make decisions whether you're providing content domain scores, are you providing an overall score, are you providing scores at all, or do you just give direction to your constituents, and then the remediation comes primarily in the form of the instructional design, as well as performance classifications. There's also some discussions to be had when we're considering performance evaluations and formative assessments about the latent trait estimate being on a single dimension, and yet we're investigating quite often unique aspects of content breakdown. And you've heard this at multiple discussions throughout the conference over the last couple of days. This is a very common practice, but I think we really should think about this in the context of how we're actually surfacing that information to constituents. Also, how do these performance evaluations really relate to remediations? How does that really relate to the trajectory of the learning, and what kind of information can we glean from their performance in order to sort of have this feedback loop that allows us to then make modifications to the specific resources or instruction that we give students? So performance evaluations have to really be effective, and they will only be effective when they're providing a call to action to both the student but also to the educators. And that's really at the heart of formative assessment. So there is the simulation that I want to present to you today is really based on the motivation that formative assessment is growing and developing. There's really an exciting time. Back in 1999, Kaplan actually launched the very first online quiz bank. You may have heard the term QBank, commonly referred to as such, which really sought to provide students with that locus of control for them to practice and review content, and paired with formalized instruction that proved to be a really optimal, maximizing kind of experience for students. And the QBank allows students currently, so this is the non-adaptive QBank, allows students to practice whatever topic they feel they really need to focus on, and it is self-paced. So they're in fact picking how many questions they want to answer, and also the temporal spacing that's associated with this practicing. So the one shortcoming here is that in those kinds of environments, reporting is largely descriptive and at best normative in some aspects. It's descriptive in that we can provide a review of the questions that the student has been served up or that has been selected from a pool, and it can be normative in the sense of giving some proportions of the cohort that's endorsing a similar response or that is getting the question correct, etc., so that the student has some means of comparison. What's really missing from this is an inferential piece. Also, there's a shortcoming in the sense of that it creates non-parallel quizzes. So as a psychometrician, this is where you cringe, because that means you really have a variability in the psychometric quality across these quizzes that are being created, self-created through the self-paced mode by the student, with varying conditional effectiveness due to the fact that you're incorporating information at various different regions of ability range, which may not essentially be within the area of proximal development for the student. And that is, in fact, what CAT is designed to do, right? CAT is designed to give us a way to hone in on the area of proximal development and give us the most relevant information for the student. So this is where CAT comes into this framework. Knowing that we have these benefits, knowing that for years now we've been reaping the benefits of computerized adaptive testing and multi-stage testing in the summative world, bringing this over into a formative assessment, bringing this into the framework where we provide feedback to students and to educators, I think is becoming more and more appealing. So since there's really no adaptive version of the QBank, this was the first stopover in trying to bring in adaptivity into this kind of formative assessment. And in the complete absence of an adaptive QBank, what we wanted to do is, what we did is essentially look at the behaviors of students in the QBank as best evidence in terms of how students are currently interacting with the QBank. Now, does this mean that if we will have an adaptive product that students will interact it with the exact same way? Absolutely not. But in terms of lack of evidence, this is the first best piece of evidence that we can glean. So notably, there's really two aspects that we should focus on when we're considering now incorporating adaptivity into this kind of formative framework. The first one is growth. So you've heard a little bit of a discussion over the conference already in terms of growth aspects. And growth tends to be problematic in educational testing. If you talk about growth between grades, for instance, and specifically between products, you have to do vertical scaling because your products have to be aligned so that you can meaningfully demonstrate growth across grades. When you're doing it within a grade, this is where hopefully your scale is constructed in such a way that you have enough sort of room that you can demonstrate propensity of growth on that particular latent trait. But it really raises a whole lot of questions in terms of recency effects, etc. The second aspect is really this self-paced testing. That is not something that is germane to summative assessment. There's a day, you come on that day, and there's a test form that you take. And if it's a CAT, there's very clear rules about what the CAT is in order for you to get your license, in order for you to get your score. Not so much informative assessment. And I think this comes really out of the fact that when we're thinking about the sort of self-paced element, it really is in the locus of control of the student to tell us how many quizzes, how many items. And that creates a new problem or a new horizon of exploration and research for formative assessment because it means there is no formal termination rule. So let's think about this. A CAT with no formal termination rule. Either that's exciting or very scary. I don't know yet myself, but I think it really does provide a lot of good food for thought. So, within this aspect, Kaplan wanted to have its first empirical simulation study to really investigate whether we can take that framework of the QBank, take the framework of that formative assessment, and put into it really at the heart a CAT engine that really will drive all these kinds of aspects. So, on the topic of growth, as a test prep organization, obviously we believe in growth because if you come to a test prep organization, the whole point is that you want to improve and in fact master the skills that you do not have yet to be successful on the test for which you're preparing. Now, growth we know is not instantaneous. Growth does not, you do not move 2 standard deviations away from where you are overnight. This takes a lot of time, and in fact, when you look at educational testing, you look at classical test products, even between grades, those kinds of movements are rare, if just non-existent. So what does growth really look like? So using some of the historic data that we have, as well as making some of the assumptions about unidirectionality, so this model can be expanded many different ways, including a lot of information, but I don't have time to cover all of that here. But we're just assuming unidirectionality in terms of that you will not deteriorate, that you can, in fact, if we model growth, gain some of that ability or remediate appropriately and then move your true score up. And when you look at the example down here for English, because we will have 2 content domains, one in mathematics, one in English, you can see that we're certainly not normally distributed and that the growth itself is pretty minimal. In this condition, the growth that is considered, now there is a max, and in fact if you look at what this growth is distributed for English, there is a ceiling effect. If you're already 2 standard deviations above the average examinee, you do not have the propensity to move up any further. However, if you're 2 or 3 standard deviations below the mean, below the average latent trait, you do have that propensity. But now you start having interactive effects associated with the fact that the high ability students are very highly motivated to review and remediate and look at all of the content provided. But students that are low ability students may not necessarily want to do as much remediation. They may not look at as much information, which is why you see where most of the growth is quite minimal, and we have the occasional student that sort of has an extreme kind of growth, and you see that in the distribution. So when you look at the median, right, if it's the 50th quantile, that is marginal growth. We have 0.02 of a point on the latent trait scale in terms of growth for 50% of the distribution or 50% of the population below. So you have that ceiling effect. Now, the second focus that we talked about is the self-paced testing. And here we know that students can pick the number of questions they want to answer, they can pick the number of testing occasions they want to experience, and so that means there's no finite testing goal in terms of the actual assessment piece. That does, however, mean that for formative assessment, we have this implicit in that process, the implicit goal is that you want to have content mastery. But that is a moving goal that is not formalized in terms of finding a parameter that's associated with that, explicitly in this example. So there's another problem about variable temporal spacing. Some students who understand the learning process, so this is now aspects that in fact can be modeled in terms of metacognition, so thinking about thinking and thinking about learning, students understand that cramming or reviewing all of your information just over the course of one night is not going to teach you anything. So you should probably space this out. Students that do rapid testing, in fact, will not really have that information. So when we simulated our examinees, we did deep conditioning of the behaviors, which means we in fact looked at a distribution and there's no sampling from a normal, there's no making assumptions that this is all nicely distributed. We assume this is horribly distributed, really weird sort of proportional peaks that are not really smoothed out by any function. And so when we're simulating the behavior, explicitly the behavior, not the latent trait, not the response patterns, but the behavior, we essentially looked at a field test over 3 months and looked at 6,000 examinees of how they behaved, and then simulated essentially this adaptive QBank using the behavior patterns of our students in the field test study. So the setup essentially is we have a small item pool here with about 920 mathematics items, 716 English items. The pool was scaled to those two unique independent unidimensional scales with a 2-parameter logistic model. We used the deep conditioning to sample or create the behaviors of our examinees. If you read the original Efron papers on resampling and bootstrapping, there's a lot of discussion about when you're making these sampling kinds of behaviors, it should be about the same size as based on the sample that you've originally observed, right? So since we're sort of sampling from those behaviors very deeply conditionally, we simulated 6,000 examinees at all of our conditions to replicate that proportionality. And we don't assume that the ability is normally distributed. In learning science in general, and particularly in test prep, ability is not normally distributed. We get a very sort of sub-portion of the population, and so that was also modeled accordingly. We're using maximum information with a random mask selector. There's other conditions that I just don't have the time to talk about that really explored the viability of this and the sustainability of the item pool given that you're making these decisions. And then the final termination is just based on the student-specific behavior. So there is not a single student in the simulation whose behavior we did not actually observe in real life. So the conditions are here defined essentially in terms of our systematic error associated with how we believe this to be true. And so we either have a growth or no growth, and when it says growth, it's really that minimal growth I talked about. And you also made considerations in terms of how do you actually evaluate the performance then? And so on one hand, you can say any item the student has ever taken on the right-hand side is viable for us to evaluate their performance. But if it's true that you're observing growth, if we're effective in teaching the students something and remediating this whole process, then this actually does a disservice in many ways because the students' true score is no longer in the same location. And so while they may have answered incorrect, given incorrect responses to easier items early on, you're now essentially corrupting sort of the true state of their ability. So based on some historic elements with linear quizzes, also from a very similar pool, 20 item quizzes were historically used to sort of evaluate some of these intermediate tests and formative assessments within the learning study plan. And so we went with, looking back at 20 items. There was, again, other conditions, but again, I'm just presenting these two. So this is what our item pools looked like. Math is a bit better distributed across the latent trait. We see more of a consistency. If you think about the density associated with those difficulty, English is certainly more leptokurtic, and it is also a bit more reflective of what the distribution actually looks like of abilities associated with our students. So in terms of the results, this is not particularly meaningful because this just gives you about the effectiveness of the deep sampling. So this just tells you that across our 4 condition, in terms of the quizzes and topics and items that students were selecting or how they were simulated, that they were consistent against what we saw in the field test study. This is where it gets more interesting. Because here we're now looking at the relationship associated with the systematic error and, of course, the random error of our measurement from the model. And this is in an overall state. If you've done any work in computerized adaptive testing, you know that looking at these aggregates is usually pretty meaningless because you're losing most of the information that's relevant at the actual latent trait scale. But this will give you a directional idea of what is really happening here. And I think what's fascinating in a way is that when we do assume minimal growth, I mean very small amounts of growth in a 3-month period, what we see is we actually have a bias estimate when we're using only the last 20 items the student has given us. Now, this could be across multiple testing occasions, and again, you could build in temporal components using all kinds of hierarchical IRT models, which we've also explored, but that's maybe next ICAT. And what you can see is that essentially that bias is much larger for when we're considering everything in the growth model, in the growth scenario. When we're considering this in English, we see that is not entirely true. The systematic error there is about comparable. So what happens then when we break this down by topic, you see that sort of that relationship holds true or holds very similar. So the bottom line there is that what we really want to do ultimately, I think, is go with considering all items when student-governed termination rules are based exclusively on the fact of how many items they've taken, and that's the universe of information we have, because what we're gaining here is, of course, that systematic monotone decreasing random error that's just associated with the conditional standard error of measurement. So in reporting, this is what some of the proposed reporting looks like. I believe I am pretty much out of time. So I just wanted to spend 1 or 2 more minutes on this, because this is really at the meat of what's happening in terms of the remediation for formative assessment. This is a kind of score report that essentially is coming out of this entire experience that is split out into our 2 unidimensional scales, but we're giving them information to students and our constituents essentially on a continuum that is intuitive to them, weaker to stronger. Mind you, there's a lot of numbers in here that the student wouldn't necessarily see, but this is sort of for the psychometric purposes of evaluating this. And of course, this is the one part that is the most viable in calling this sustainable, because it's the call to action. If you have practiced, and this is after the second assessment of the student, what should I do next? That is what a student wants to know. And us as an organization, we want to be able to tell you, we have videos that might be really good for topic 5, and topic 5 is very important for you to be successful on the full-length test. That 1 is essentially an ordinal ranking of your opportunity. Go and practice topic 5. So we can weigh that distribution based on a variety of different aspects. If you think about how we weigh those topics and how we understand that call to action, if you look at the contour plot, if somebody's really high ability and we have a fairly good confidence in terms of that estimate, there's really no reason to call that to action, right? We can downweight the importance of that particular topic in essentially making our recommendation to the student. So this is what a live admin, once we gave this to so we took the simulation and then we gave this to a very small group of field test students, and this is sort of what that live admin was looking like, except for the students didn't really see the numbers, they just saw the bars. And what you can see here is that this student over the course of about 3 months is taking 120 quizzes in total, but what they're doing is they're actually only on 13 of those quizzes are using topic 6 for a total of 91 items. And so even though it might look like this is done, but actually if you look at the top, it's still moving because the student is actually still remediating, still reviewing. So because I am out of time, what I do want to say is that there's of course some impact challenges here. I think what we found in the field test, as well as when we had our user experience testing with students who integrated with this, really found it not only intuitive, but very helpful to be told specifically based on their performance what to remediate, what to focus on, and how to do it, which resources to go with. So while this is not really adaptive learning yet, there's still a lot of works to go, I think this is really making the first forays into that direction to really understand that. And so with the future directions, I think it's really going to be in terms of understanding the adequacy of the pool given this kind of framework. And also, I think, coming up with some of the solutions around what does it really mean to be effective in this kind of formative assessment with full adherence to the recommendations, and how can we expand on this using other components, such as the temporal time issue associated with quizzes being generated apart by months versus a couple of days, which was taken into consideration in the modeling of the behavior, but not really taken into consideration in the actual evaluation of the performance. So thank you very much, and I believe we're out of time for questions, so I don't know. I think maybe we'll just wait until the end, and maybe 2 questions then, yes, if anybody had a... No? Well, oh, please.
So if I understand right, the person will practice whatever their worst at, right?
Sorry, say that again.
The student will practice whatever they're worst at, right?
They're supposed to. So in the non-adaptive sense, they're just giving the topics, and then they themselves have to really make that decision. Once we incorporate adaptivity, we can see, based on a couple of questions already, you're fairly strong, and this might be a topic that's 80% of the exam. But if you've mastered this one aspect of the exam already, and you're very weak in the strands that make up the other 20%, we can make that recommendation based on what and how certain we are in terms of your performance.
So I just wondered if it would have an effect on motivation. Every time I go to this thing, it gives me the hardest stuff, and then I start avoiding it.
Yeah, so keep in mind that CAT gives you items within your area of proximal development, right? Unless you have some weird random starting values, which is when a lot of these simulations are usually presented. I tend to have an issue with them, right? But a student shouldn't see, if you're a low ability student, you shouldn't see an item that's 4 standard deviations above the average difficulty. You should be seeing within your area. The concept here is that once we are fairly certain about where you are, then just taking more tests doesn't teach you anything. What teaches you is understanding why you got questions correct. There's an entire review page that I couldn't show you, because students are actually then asked to go and review your quizzes. Read the questions. This includes the questions you got correct. Do you know why you got it correct? And then, after you feel that you're more comfortable with the content domain and understand the cognitive process, come back and retest again and see if you've actually moved up your skill and have a skill that now allows the CAT to pick more difficult items for you, because that's in your area of proximal development.
This kind of a formative assessment, is there any role for teacher?
Oh, yeah. So the teacher, so when we actually took all of the simulation information before it went into the field test, and they in fact looked at the full profiles of the kinds of students that we simulated to actually see how this can be incorporated into the instructional design. So for instance, having videos, having extra quizzes that may not be adaptive, but having other materials to teach, the teachers can look at this and say, we can actually now customize the teaching to a particular student, because I see how they're changing over time and what they're most reactive to. Now, that can also be improved as time goes on. This is also very hungry for multiple assets. We think in CAT about an asset as an item, but in terms of formative assessment, assets are also videos and lesson plans and exercises and projects, and so that's the next generation. Anyways, thank you very much. I think I'm totally out of time now, and yeah, thank you.